So I'm Stuart, a principal engineer working on Amazon Linux. And for our sort of next generation of Amazon Linux, as people may be aware, we've been a bit more open about Fedora being an upstream. And it's been sort of great to, over the sort of period of time that we've had sort of the OS in preview, to sort of send a bunch of things upstream to Fedora where appropriate, and sort of start discussions and think about what are maybe larger things we want to work on, or what is the sort of best way to have interaction with Fedora in here. And I'll totally grab Luna's question here, because I think the most important thing is to talk and answer questions, and how we do. So interested more about Amazon Linux, how does it differ from Fedora, and what Fedora version is it based on? Will you update it to be based on 37 in the future? It's actually a pretty common question we get, like even from customers who are using Amazon Linux 1 and Amazon Linux 2 today. And the best way that I try to describe it is, like, Amazon Linux is its own thing. We have it as its own Linux distribution, and we make decisions in it according to our customer base, and to satisfy our customer base. The benefit of saying, hey, based in Fedora, is that we're very open about that. At some point, things get updated, right? And sort of the eventual consistency model of everything, you could say that we eventually get a bunch of changes from Fedora, but it's certainly not a rebuild or a spin of Fedora, and that way it's definitely sort of based on. So if you're going to describe and go, like, as of Amazon Linux 2022 today, what would you say it's based on? You'd say, like, well, there is a large number of components there that have deep origins in Fedora, some of which have origins in Fedora via CentOS Streams. And some of these components are things like that, hey, we're definitely looking at a longer life cycle. It makes sense to sort of synchronize on rough versions there, and use CentOS Streams as a collaboration point for it. Some stuff is talking about coming from sort of other upstreams, or sort of our own packages we've worked on, and modifications to it. And some of those have headed upstream into Fedora, others of them we've held off on a little bit to try and have the larger conversation. So some things where you'd say it differs from Fedora is like we might turn different options on and off in packages and in beacons. Much like if you look at like what builds in like in CentOS, you notice that, hey, there's different beacons there on some features and packages. So we are very intentional about what we do and do not turn on. And a bunch of those times what we've ended up with is spec files which have, if AMZN, else if, Enterprise Linux, else if Fedora, else, and you're like, this nested series of ifs around beacons is probably not where we want to go into the future. It sort of make things sort of messier rather than cleaner. And we'd rather think about how might we approach this in a way that when we view the problem set here, where we're now having a couple of downstream distributions from Fedora that want to make different decisions here, how might we go in and go, no one should really have to maintain weird forks here. That doesn't help anyone. And have a maintenance burden, and it should be easy to be able to create downstream distributions of Fedora. So what is a practical series of suggestions we can do there, and ways that we can sort of upstream a bunch of that, and to make that go. Add a poll to your event. I can add polls? Cool. I don't know how to. I would happily add polls. It'd be amazing. So how does it differ from Fedora is that you would say it is definitely a subset of Fedora, right? We don't ship every package that's in Fedora in Amazon Linux 22. We are intentional about what we selected there, and trying to satisfy the core sort of customer needs of people coming from Amazon Linux 2 and Amazon Linux 1. And also Fedora is like a much sort of wider variety of packages there that may or may not exist for the next 5 years, which is our support period. And some of which may move a bit more rapidly than we want to in that. So we want to make sure that we select that and ensure that we go forward. So there's a bunch of sort of package selection there, and what options we turn on and off. And we do a lot of things based on the knowledge that our customer base is running in the cloud in some regard. And so even if we look at like what options do we enable in like the kmod package in order to do with kernel modules, we can make selections based on that, where it's like we don't actually need to support bzip2 compressed on a file system kernel modules if we have an init ramfs that's already exit sorry, Z standard compressed, and if it would otherwise make the init ramfs larger, because we can probably shave, milliseconds off reading that data from disk and extracting the init ramfs, which turns out to be over the size of EC2 and AWS, a non-trivial amount of CPU time and I/O savings for customers. We make certain choices like that on it. Oh, there's a Q&A tab that can add for it there. Cool. I will actually switch to that tab in a moment as well. So what Fedora version is it based on is a good question for Amazon Linux 2022. And the answer is several, right? We actually started around the same point that like a CentOS 9 did, which is a Fedora 34 base. And then progressively picked things up from newer Fedoras sort of as needed and as we were like evolving through the preview and development cycle. As well as looking at what things there would be better with a sort of a CentOS 9 stream upstream rather than a Fedora one, simply because to keep on some versions that were of some components that are going to live for a long time. And then what bits did we needed to mix and match and modify? So to say like what Fedora version is it based on, it's a sort of several. It is definitely based on Fedora. It's the most accurate way to say, but it's various different versions and combined in different ways. And in order to make that as a cohesive product as part of the offering. And we just like to be open about the fact that, you know what, a lot of stuff based on Fedora in there, and it is sort of different versions in there, and make sure that, credit is given where credit is due. There's a bunch of good development constructing here it is, all the new wonderful things distribution in Fedora, which is like why I've used it on desktops and laptops for I don't know how many years now. It's getting to be a long time. Part-time, yes, probably since Fedora Core 1, and sort of full-time on something for less years than that, but longer than I can reasonably remember. And one of the sort of neat differences that we get to do for some things here is like we get to look at things like the Java ecosystem inside the distribution. And we actually have at Amazon a team called the Corretto team, which produce a OpenJDK distribution called Corretto. And for us, it's sort of a no-brainer in that regard to say, like, we should ship Corretto as our JDK and work with the Corretto team both to make various packages in there work with it, which turns out to be mostly sort of interesting packaging work where someone's done build dependencies on an OpenJDK devel package rather than the abstract Java devel package, all those little things along the way, which ends up being sort of small changes you get to get into packages and put pull requests up for. But we get to differ in that way as well and say, like, you know what, some of these things, let's use the JDK that we have people maintaining it and are keen to go for it. We get to make those kind of differences as well. So will we update it to be based on Fedora 37? It's like some bits already are and have been for a little while. So that's sort of pretty interesting, right? Where it's like certain components we can move faster and maybe have multiple different versions available of. And that's sort of what we do even in some Amazon Linux versions today, such as AL2, where some components move faster than others. And sort of the great thing about having sort of Fedora there as an upstream is we can either like move something forward in Fedora when we need to and sort of cherry pick it back. Or when we're doing something like, oh, how do we get a newer version of Python and namespace it in there? It's like, well, the odds of it either already being there or being in progress and something we can jump in and help on is actually pretty high. So, in order to, definitely you want to do the right thing and pick up, quality packaging and help fix things and get in the OS stage. But yeah, we were picking up things that was going to become Fedora 37, I think, before even the branch was created. It was kind of fun to see that way and go, like, where did we want to go for different components and for their lifetime? And there was already bits based on it, but it's not completely any one version of Fedora. So we're very open about saying that we are based on Fedora. It is not directly compatible with any one version of Fedora, and that's very intentional. And thus, don't expect any random RPMs that you download from any random version of Fedora to work on Amazon Linux 2022, either today or in the future, because the dependencies are not the same as they are in a particular Fedora version, right? It's its own operating system. It's based on, but has sort of a whole bunch of different choices there. Cool. I can confirm and notify that Q&A is open in there. So I don't know, hopefully that was a very long and interesting explanation of sort of where we were with Amazon Linux 2022 and some relationships to Fedora there. I'd be happy to see sort of other questions and talk about through things that might be interesting. Or even random trivia. I'm very, very keen to discuss interesting things. I can talk about actually some really interesting stuff that's sort of long term as well. So one of the joys of talking about having Fedora as an upstream and being more open about that and talking about our product release cycle being a new major version every 2 years and supporting it for 5 is that we got to talk with a bunch of teams around Amazon about this. And a recent thing, as in I think it was about yesterday or the day before, I'm trying to remember which day it was. I think it was the day before. I got a Slack message from a colleague who works in an area that helps to look at audit logs for Amazon, around like Linux audit system, and you try and like correlate these events together to help check what's going on in a fleet and doing sort of exactly what you'd expect to do with audit logs, and analyzing them. And it's now actually, I think it might even be 2 years ago. They're looking at Amazon Linux 2 and looking at the audit logs emitted from OpenSSH. And there was a bit of extra information they wanted in the audit logs. And at the time, sort of we know like, hey, we're going to probably have this next version of Amazon Linux based on Fedora in here. And we're very much not wanting to carry patches forever. Right? We knew that there's going to be a new version of the operating system at some point, and we don't want to carry patches forever. So thinking about how do we have maybe not upstream first, but upstream simultaneously or upstream eventually in there, it was like, hey, how do we get this patch in here which modifies what information is available in the audit log in there? And it turns out when you dive deep into that, a bunch of the ways that we get things in the audit log from OpenSSH is actually not in upstream portable OpenSSH. It's downstream patches carried in Fedora and Centos. And also downstream patches that we also have in Amazon Linux. And so it was like, well, this is actually a modification to that patch. And so we sort of did sort of the deal, right, where it's like we could carry something in AL2, but at some point we need to talk about this needs to get upstream. Because we shouldn't carry sort of the downstream patches forever, as that carries a certain ongoing maintenance risk, and indeed has a maintenance risk of any particular day where it's hard to correlate it with maybe a security fix or something, and there's a risk in there. So the useful thing is that that's just hit Fedora 38. Like as of the other day, the update's hitting there in Bodhi. And in updates, there's Bugzilla there that ends up being fixed. So it's one of those small things of where it's being able to link two things together. And I'm even trying to remember the exact two things it was. It's one of those wonderful, deep things that's really relevant if you're wanting to look at audit logs and is otherwise something you might not think of. So it's something where you want to have additional information about the SSH keys used to log in, and using sort of SSH certificates from trusted CAs, and wanting to know the ID of the key in principle that is logging in. And so it's sort of really interesting and useful for this use case where it's like multiple principals have been granted access to the account. And so it's one of those kind of things where it's like that sort of long-term thing where it's now no longer just like, hey, here's a patch that's downstream in here, but it is something that is now in sort of the entire sort of Fedora and downstream distributions. So it's kind of nice to sort of see this sort of thing come to fruition where you're successful in going like, okay, let's get the development done where it needs to get done and in the upstream that's appropriate, and that we can sort of bring that back in and have that available. So I can talk about things that we did to improve Fedora that are hitting Fedora 38, that the Fedora 37 release party is kind of cool. And that was sort of a nice recent sort of thing that was gratifying to see. And it helps that sort of stuff to scale, right? Where it's like, there's easy ways to contribute and go in there that is on a sort of more relaxed time frame of like when it gets into Fedora release, and then we can work out what we bring in Amazon Linux and what version there. Michael asks, what was the incentive for basing Fedora directly instead of CentOS? There's a couple of different reasons for that, actually. And it's an interesting one. So when we were doing all the decisions way back and sort of starting development, Centos Streams didn't yet exist. So we're definitely making decisions in sort of a different environment. And post Centos Streams and the changes there, it's something that we definitely wanted to think about and sort of re-examine what do we do. And the big thing that sort of we think about is that there are a bunch of parts of the OS, and especially in Amazon Linux, that we do move quicker. And that can include the container runtime ecosystem, and indeed we make different choices there. So even in Amazon Linux 2, we're still all Docker and containerd, and that's because we have a bunch of services at AWS that run containers and that run on that ecosystem. And it's the same stack in AL 2022, simply to support those services. And it makes sense where it's like we've got a huge sort of investment in service offering in an ecosystem that we continue to package it and make it work. And so there's a bunch of different choices that end up happening. And we're looking at it and going like, where is the right places to make these choices and base off? And when you have these other things that move faster, like moving containerd faster, or maybe packaging and offering multiple versions of different runtimes and databases and such, how much do we end up being based on Fedora anyway over time for some of these major leaf packages? And then when we look at sort of the core sort of dependency graph in there, is there a huge difference, and might we want to move something sort of faster or slower than what would end up being based on a CentOS? And because a CentOS is already I don't want to say spin, there's a sort of a derived version of Fedora with a bunch of choices in there. If we wanted to make sort of different ones at a higher level, is it easier to do that within a CentOS space? Is it easier to do that within a Fedora base, or combine them together? And one of the good things about Fedora is that it's very much designed to be able to create a downstream distribution of. And this is sort of like one of those things where it is a whole OS that is designed to work together. And extracting out part of that to build something else of is something that is of course work. Like, we haven't been sitting here doing nothing. But it is an OS that's designed to work all together and rebuild itself, and is sort of that one atomic unit, and that does move forward in various fast ways. And so that was sort of our reason of sort of saying we're starting directly from Fedora. That being said, there's a bunch of components that make sense to collaborate on in CentOS 9 Streams. I think Centos Streams is great from a collaboration point of view. It is absolutely fantastic to have the ability there to go like, you know what, here is a pull request. Here is something that sort of makes sense in the context of these long-term Linux distributions that end up having sort of Fedora as an upstream. And that's a place that we've been sending some patches and sending some fixes as well. And that's actually, I think, a great thing where we can work out like, what makes sense to maintain in what context, where we have overlap, what makes sense to be differently, and sort of use that as a feature of collaboration. So CentOS Streams is great, and ends up being that some components of the OS are based on CentOS, and that's everything from how do we make making downstream distributions a bit easier, and that's either for us for CentOS and derivatives, as well as anyone else wants to base something off Fedora, and that can be all little weird things inside RPM macros as well. And there's things like, here is a patch to LSHW to make it, when you run dash version, not do a DNS query. It turns out we don't want things doing DNS queries out of it. And that's something easy to sort of backport in there to an LSHW and go like, this is probably relevant to CentOS and Rail customers as well. And it's also a great thing that CentOS exists in the way it is in there, because our aim here is to make EC2 the best place to run Linux workloads. And often that involves, hey, if we can get upstream in as many places as possible, it's something that makes life better for customers in there. That's the real benefit, right? I have no problem being able to make CentOS better for customers running on EC2, and no problem making Fedora better for customers running on EC2. Fedora gets that nice thing of like, you can easily get new packages in. So it's a much easier way to explain like, hey, we want to ship a new agent, which is something that teams do. When to ship new functionality, it needs to talk to these things and these things, but it's a new package. Fedora's got a great new process for getting new packages in. It's well defined. We can deal with it there. And if we get in Fedora, it's going to always work, and be sure that it continues to work with like, here is newer tool chains for what's building it, and newer dependencies in there, and keep that up to date. So when we come to build the next version of Amazon Linux, we will have been doing that sort of maintenance work over time, and coordinating with the team that's owning that new piece of software, and it will sort of save everyone a whole bunch of time. So that's sort of why sort of Fedora is great. It's that ever rolling forward piece of development that we get to things going, and is a good sort of central point for let's integrate sort of all new great technologies in the Linux and open source ecosystem. Okay, what have we got? So I asked Michael's one there, instead of facing Fedora. We have support, we have ARM on Amazon Linux. Yes, we have support for ARM on Amazon Linux 2 today, and we've got more support for ARM on Amazon Linux 2022. So we build for and require a sort of a Graviton 2 ARM processor or higher in there. So we've really optimized in for ensuring that sort of the newer ARM instruction sets that do sort of better multi-core scalability and everything, and performance, we're optimizing there. So our sort of base GCC tunings and everything there are to make sort of, get the performance on the ARM processors and EC2 as good as possible. So we have ARM support there and have had it since day one, and get to have sort of improvements on various bits there over what we could do inside Amazon Linux 2. So that's pretty cool. Christian asks, can one download an AWS Fedora ISO image without having an AWS account in order to test it? So Fedora itself, right, is available inside EC2. The Fedora cloud images are available, and that's produced by Fedora. It's a Fedora project thing, which is to have some armies in there. If we're talking about Amazon Linux, which is separate than Fedora, we don't actually ship ISOs, amazingly enough, and we don't use ISOs even in the Fedora context of talking about how we run it in the cloud. So we do armies and container images as our big release vehicles for Amazon Linux, and armies are a bootable disk image that boots up, talks to metadata services in a cloud, and can boot things up. And amazingly enough, we're not actually a distro that really has an installer. So the model of sort of having an ISO image around is less of something that we have, and this is because we do use it internally. We do use it on more sort of metal-like machines in there, but we don't have someone clicking installer buttons or automating it. It's we splat an image out. So we deal with it much like the same way you would in a cloud environment, and you have an image on a disk appear, and you boot it, and you go for your life, which is a really sort of different and interesting way to think about how do you set up the operating system for the first time. How much can you set it up to sort of self-configure itself from a pre-laid out disk image? And that is something that's really easy to do in a cloud environment in like EC2 for armies. A bit more interesting on metal and the like, but you can in fact grab sort of our container images there and go and run it. So how I do it, literally all of us on a development thing, is we don't launch the cloud instance all the time. You run the container and you get to test things out there. For AL2, we also had some images that were for development and test purposes, which is for booting inside KVM or on VMware or Hyper-V in there for sort of on-prem sort of virtualization, trying it out. And they were still not an ISO, they were a disk image. And you'd use sort of the same way you configure a cloud instance, which is using cloud in it. And you do this in a way where you sort of have a seed ISO file and put some initialization there. So it's a different way of sort of setting up an OS in that regard. And that's something we're probably going to have for AL 2022 as well. But I'd say if you want to actually try out and poke around what is in Amazon Linux 2022 and how that relates to, the easiest way on any machine is to run the container image. You can pull it from ECR or Docker Hub, and we have all the container images there for x86 and ARM, x86 64 and ARM, I should say. And that's sort of how we do it internally as development. I do a lot of stuff inside containers on AL 2022. Either locally on my work Ubuntu laptop or containers on, if I'm weirdly looking at something on the weekend, where you totally tell yourself you should not, but you're going to because it's convenient, is to run it inside my Fedora image, maybe running a VM on a Mac or running on an actual Fedora bare metal machine that I have here. And we use a container image. And that's sort of the great way to sort of test out stuff. Containers are really useful in that way. And do you think there could be a time after longer term investment from Amazon when you're using more and more of the latest version of Fedora? That's a good question. In the fact that I don't know, right? It's one of those things where for use at Amazon, like teams are encouraged to make own good decisions in there. And we try and make Amazon Linux a good blend of that. And it's also one of those things where we can give sort of strong advice to teams where it's, if you have us provide the OS, like we have to care about a lot about security patching and security response and everything. And that sort of alleviates a lot of pain in some ways, because like we're very invested in making sure that all our tooling works together with it. We have teams that use Fedora, like use Fedora to do development in Fedora and send patches to Fedora often. And even a bunch of sort of, early AL 2022 development was done, on Fedora and inside Fedora containers. So there's definitely sort of some use in there. And we're also, very much interested in making sure that we don't have a endless growing sort of set of downstream patches, which may enable sort of Fedora to sort of suit more of some of those use cases. But Fedora is also a very different life cycle than a lot of customers who pick Amazon Linux, and that can be a differentiating factor as well, right? Like with Fedora, with its release every 6-ish months, support for 13-ish, right? It is a very rapidly moving life cycle for a distribution, and that may or may not suit people developing applications and solutions and services on Fedora, which is why we have a different sort of support lifecycle in there. And it's those different decisions and trade-offs, right? And that's a very interesting thing. And I don't pretend to speak for other people and other services about what is and is not suitable for them. I know a bunch of what Amazon Linux customers do and Linux customers on EC2, and it's generally all a combination of those. It's like having someone to call for support, having life cycle in there, and there is that great thing where Fedora is an excellent place for collaboration there that sort of gets into these longer term and well backed and commercially supported stuff on AWS, as well as being a good place to go like, hey, we can fix some things in Fedora, we can improve some things in Fedora, and that makes Fedora itself better and a transitive property of the downstream distribution. So it's a good place to point to and go like, hey, here is this, what do we think? Related back from an anonymous question about AWS Fedora Docker images. So should point out that, again, that for Amazon Linux, separate to Fedora, it's not based on a particular version of it in there. And we do have Amazon Linux container images that are usable in Docker and other container runtimes. And they're posted on the Amazon ECR registry, which is the Elastic Container Registry, which is our container registry service. And we also have them up on Docker Hub. So you can run Amazon Linux containers, Amazon Linux 1, 2, or 2022 as containers on anywhere that you go and run containers that are compatible with our binaries. And the Fedora Docker images and container images are, again, like something coming from Fedora itself. The efforts inside Fedora to make good container things. Carl asks, what are some notable contributions that AWS has made back into Fedora? This is a question I actually keep getting, and then I wish that like I'd kept better track, and that we had a better way to map people's corporate email accounts to Fedora account services login, and was mentioning this, and it turns out that we're not the only people with this problem, of course. Is to sort of better track as what are we working on in there. One of the things we've worked hard to enable is to make it really easy for anyone, both inside Amazon Linux and other places of the company, to make contributions back to sort of a whole bunch of open source software, including Fedora. And that's really cool to see, where we see a lot of sort of little things in there that like I don't know about, right? Like, so the thing I was talking about before, where it's modifying the audit logging that happens when you're doing like certain types of logins to the OpenSSH. It's one of those things where, honestly, if the person hadn't Slack messaged me the other day, like 2 days ago, saying, "Hey, I got this upstream," and feeling proud about it, it's not something I would have necessarily known that we actually contributed. It just would have been something we accidentally got at some point, which is fantastic. Like, I know like things that I've ended up contributing back in, which is a lot of little minor fixes even around the place. Everything from like, oh, hey, this upstream source table does actually have a GPG signature we could verify. Let's go follow the Fedora packaging guidelines there and GPG verify the source table. That's definitely happened a bunch. Like, I think one day I sat down and weirdly did a dozen on them and wanted to continue going, but then had to fix sort of real problems, so to speak, and fix some other bugs. There's everything from like compile bug fixes there is to trying to make it easier to do sort of a downstream distribution by like tweaking how we lay out some RPM macros in that. Doing a lot of those sort of little like, paper cuts things when you're trying to get sort of a new OS off the ground. And that's sort of like where we see a lot of contribution there currently. And there's naturally other things we go and look at for things to do inside Fedora, and things we've done and things that should be upstream. So there's some stuff there now. There's some stuff that we have downstream that should head upstream, and some stuff that's downstream that should upstream but be cleaned up. So there's a lot of little sort of paper cuts in there around the place that we've gone and done. Like I've mentioned before, like LSL HW things as well, and the like. And it's one of those things that I'm definitely going to probably have to assemble a wiki page internally for, so we can keep track of it and work out if it's something we want to track going forward. But I love the fact there's so much stuff going on around the place that I don't know about the details. And so it's also things like we're in the process of getting all of the AWS CLI v2 packaged in for Fedora as well. That's in progress. There is a new package called Credential Helper, which helps do, let's see if I can remember this correctly. There is a way when you run containers on Windows that you get authentication from Active Directory, and that works on Windows because there's Windows components doing it, and the team implemented it for Linux. Basically, the idea is like, you want to run this thing on Linux rather than Windows, but you don't want to change your entire authentication system to get credentials. Like, well, use this bit of software. And the discussion with them was, let's get it in Fedora, and let's consume it from there. Like, let's get the dependencies working there and keep it going. And so there's been those sort of additional packages going on in there, and that's sort of pretty cool. Teams all on board with it and making it go. So that's kind of nice that happens where you're looking at sort of dependencies in there and launching sort of new bits of software where it lands in Fedora first, or at least simultaneously. Well, Fedora 37 released, and I think it's in 37. So I think Fedora beat us to the punch there to having it out. I guess we're sort of running out of time, but I'm happy to keep going for a little question here, and working on the SSM agent too. Yeah, cool. Yep, see things like David Duncan and Major and everyone working on like the SSM agent and stuff happening. It's like I love it. I love it. For the question about landscape, can satellite be used with Fedora? I don't know. I think that's maybe more of a satellite and landscape folk in there. But all of these various bits of packaging work that will go up in there ends up happening, and that's sort of a nice sort of organic growth over time as well. I was curious if you're familiar with the Ubuntu landscape. This is something that works out Fedora. Is Ubuntu landscape a product or something? I'm not sure. That I don't know about. I know a bunch about Ubuntu, and I've used it a bunch as well, and it's very popular on AWS as well. But I'm not sure with the capital L landscape. And Michael's question here, did Amazon Linux change the version number to the year because Amazon Linux 2022 sounded better than Amazon Linux 3? Version number doesn't matter much, just curious. There's actually two reasons for that. Luna says, Ubuntu Landscape is a product for taking care of a lot of Ubuntu deployments at a company. We have a bunch of services that do that inside EC2 to help you look after doing things and managing stuff like SSM, to knowing about patching, to all of that jazz. And so we generally look at it as that thing of its ancillary services to the content of the OS itself. And so there's various things in there inside EC2 to do it. I'm not sure about sort of third-party ones in there. I know I end up talking to vendors about sort of managing things here, there, and everywhere, and there's a variety of ones in there which work with Amazon Linux. It tends to be that since I am primarily a developer, not a runner of large fleets of things, I end up using the OS in very weird ways, where I usually spin it up, ruin the instance by doing things to it that a developer does, then shut it down and get another one after doing it. And the same with containers. So it's kind of a very different use case in my day-to-day. But on the version number front, why do we pick 22 rather than 3? We wanted to signal that, hey, like this is a series of releases coming forward that's got a regular cadence, and to talk about how we're talking about a plan forward for Amazon Linux releases, not just here is one and another one might come later. The other one is that putting a year in there gives a nice way of saying when the major version was released. And when you have a nice simple math like, hey, we do a new version every 2 years and support them for 5. If the product name has the version number in it, you can start to think very easily, when am I likely to run out of security patching for this version? When do I need to upgrade? And when is the next version coming out compared to this one? And that was sort of part of the reason to basically make as the complete version number as completely semantic versioning as possible. So we talk about not just the top level one, but each army and container image is set up in a way to do deterministic updates, where if you launch an army, it is locked to a specific version of the repositories, and the same with container image. So you get this repeatable set of operations when you install packages and determinism. And you can do this based on every time we release a new army, which is every time we update a package. And you can sort of move forward and backwards, both in container image versions and armies, and get really known deterministic behavior. And so we have a version number like the one we just released is 2022.0.2022.11.02. And that's lovely and semantic, right? Because we've got 2022, the year of the OS, the major one in there. So you know that it's supported for 5 years and the next one's due 2 years afterwards. .0 is our point release, which is, you know, the semantic versioning of, you know, add new things and the like, bump it up. And the last one is the day that that revision was released. And so sort of set of security patches. So if you're running this version today, then like that's great. You know, it's security patched really recently. And if you're comparing it to the last version you're running, you know that it's a minor increment on it. If you're running this version in, you know, 4 years, then you're going to go, well, why haven't you patched for years? And there's also a new major version available. So it's really sort of one of those things, was to convey as much information as possible inside a version number. And be able to have people quickly look at that one bit of information and make many inferred bits of knowledge about the OS that's running there. So that's why we picked it. We figured that we could get a version number in there that's told a lot of information. So as people who do, you know, system administration type things and security audits in there, you can get a lot of information in a small amount of data, and that was valuable. I think we're definitely over time. I am happy to answer more. If you don't want to throw us out, otherwise I can definitely
we do have another we do have another session coming up, but it is a pre-recorded video and it's kind of short, so I let you go in with that Q&A.
Oh, excellent.
But I think for now we should move to that one just to keep things moving along. But thank you so much for answering all these questions.
Oh, great. I'm glad I could, and glad we had a bit of extra time in there. I was figuring that I would definitely get poked to be quiet if we were going too long. So thanks very much, everyone. Feel free to reach out. I'm on all sorts of places to reach out to as well.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks, everyone.